Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a look at Tor Browser and the hidden internet. We've got some really interesting sources to go over. Let's jump right in.
That's good.
So, I gotta say, this onion routing thing, it's kind of intriguing. How does that actually work?
Oh, it's pretty cool, actually. It's like, imagine sending your data through this maze of servers, and each server only knows, like, where the data came from and where it's going next, but not the whole route, so it makes it really hard to trace.
Okay, yeah, I get that. But I kind of want to get a little more technical for a sec. How does encryption work with that?
Well, what's really interesting here is it uses layers of encryption. So it's like
Okay.
wrapping your message in all these different envelopes with a different lock and key for each one. So each server in the network, basically it peels off one layer of encryption, and that only shows the address of the next server in the chain. So by the time your data gets where it's going, it's basically untraceable. And this is why it's super popular for people who need to protect their identity and their communications.
So it's like almost like those secret message drops you see in spy movies. Like each step adds another layer of, secrecy.
So if I'm getting this right, Tor is like the key to this hidden part of the internet, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We're talking about the hidden internet, or what some people call the dark web. And it's this whole network of websites that you can't find using regular search engines like Google. You need special addresses for them. They end in earth.onion, and Tor Browser is the way you get there.
Okay, now that's where things get a little
Hmm.
interesting. But let's be real, the dark web has kind of a scary reputation, right?
Hmm.
People always associate it with illegal stuff like hidden marketplaces and all that. Is that reputation accurate?
Well, there have been some illegal things happening on the dark web, like the Silk Road, for example. That was this online black market where people bought and sold all kinds of illegal things. But the dark web itself, it's not good or bad. It's just a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or bad.
Right, that makes sense. So who are the people using it for the good stuff? Well, think about journalists, especially those working on stories that could get them in trouble. Like in countries with strict governments. They might use Tor and the dark web to talk to their sources safely, so they don't put themselves or the people giving them information at risk.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anonymity is super important in those situations.
Exactly. And then you have activists, the ones fighting against oppressive regimes.
Mm-hmm.
They can use the dark web to organize and share information. They can get around censorship and connect with the outside world without having to worry about getting in trouble.
So it's almost like a digital safe haven, a way to connect with like-minded people and fight for what they believe in. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, but I bet there are a lot of misconceptions about the dark web too.
Right. Oh, absolutely. There are tons of myths and fears floating around about Tor and the dark web. For example, one of the most common ones is that using Tor is illegal. But it's not true, at least in most countries. Just using the Tor browser is perfectly legal. It's simply a tool for privacy. Like closing your curtains at home. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means you value your privacy.
That's a good analogy. It seems like people just assume that because some people use it for bad things, that the tool itself is bad.
Yeah, and that's just not the case. And then there's this idea that the dark web is only for criminals. But we've already talked about all the people using it for legitimate reasons. Remember the Panama Papers? That massive leak that exposed all that tax evasion. That was possible because journalists used Tor to talk to their source anonymously. And it had a huge impact on the world.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. Like something as simple as a web browser could be a part of something so big. It really shows you the potential of the dark web for good.
Exactly. And even beyond those big examples, there are whole communities on the dark web that are just about sharing knowledge and resources, things that might be censored elsewhere. It's constantly changing and growing.
This is all really fascinating. But there are risks involved too, right?
Of course. The dark web can be dangerous if you're not careful. That's why it's so important to know how to use it safely and responsibly. We should definitely talk about some tips for staying safe on Tor, especially if you're thinking about exploring the hidden internet.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Let's dive into that next. We'll be right back after a quick break. Just kidding, we're going to keep this deep dive going without any interruptions.
Okay, so where do we even begin with staying safe on the hidden internet?
Well, the first thing is, you always want to make sure you download Tor Browser from the official Tor Project website. That's torproject.org. Make sure you're getting it from the right place. You don't want to end up downloading some fake version that's actually malware or something.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what else should people keep in mind? This might surprise some people, but you really shouldn't use Tor for your everyday browsing. Like checking email or social media, that kind of thing.
Really? Why not?
Well, remember, Tor's all about anonymity. And that means your traffic is going through all these different servers. It makes it much slower than a regular browser.
Right. Okay.
Plus, if you're logging into things like your bank account or social media while using Tor, it can actually make it easier to figure out who you are.
Huh. That's interesting.
It's kind of like if you're trying to blend in with a crowd, you wouldn't want to suddenly start shouting your name and address, right?
That's a good way to put it. So Tor's best for specific things, like when privacy is really, really important.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about downloading files?
Downloading files on Tor can be risky. You're basically opening up a potential vulnerability in your anonymity. You never know what might be hiding in a file. It could be malware designed to reveal your real location.
So it's best to avoid it unless it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, what about plugins and extensions? Are those safe to use with Tor Browser?
Plugins and extensions can be just as bad as downloads when it comes to Tor. They can compromise your anonymity by leaking information, or even give hackers a way into your system. It's really best to just avoid them altogether when you're using Tor.
Got it. No downloads, no plugins. What else?
Be really careful about the links you click on, especially on the hidden internet. Some of those links can lead to illegal stuff, or even sites that are designed to steal your information.
So it's kind of like walking through a minefield.
Yeah, you gotta watch your step.
Okay, so we've talked about downloading Tor from the official site, not using it for everyday browsing, and avoiding downloads and plugins. Is there anything else people should know about staying safe on Tor?
One last thing. Using Tor doesn't give you a free pass to break the law. It's a tool for privacy, not a shield for doing illegal things.
Right, of course.
It's like just because you're wearing a mask doesn't mean you can rob a bank.
That's a good analogy.
You still have to be responsible for your actions.
So we've covered a lot about staying safe on Tor, but what about some of those common myths we hear about Tor and the dark web? Like, for instance, a lot of people think Tor makes you completely anonymous.
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's not entirely true. Tor is really good at enhancing your privacy. But no tool can guarantee 100% anonymity. There's always a chance that someone with enough resources and expertise could potentially track you down, especially if you make mistakes or don't use Tor correctly.
So it's not about being totally invisible, but more about making it much harder for someone to find you.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the myth that the dark web is only for criminals? We kind of touched on this earlier.
Yeah, we talked about how journalists and activists use it, and even just regular people who care about their privacy.
That one's definitely false.
Definitely.
Okay, here's another one. Using Tor is illegal. What do you think about that one?
Completely false. In most places, using Tor is perfectly legal.
It's just a tool for protecting your privacy, like using a private browsing mode on your regular browser. Just because someone cares about their privacy doesn't mean they're doing something wrong. It's a basic right to have control over your own data.
And in some places, using Tor can even be a matter of safety, like for people living under oppressive governments.
So yeah, using Tor is not a crime.
Okay, so we've busted some myths about Tor and the dark web. We've talked about how to stay safe. But why does all this even matter? Why should our listeners care about any of this?
That's a great question. I think it comes down to the importance of online privacy. We're constantly creating data about ourselves online, our browsing history, our location, our conversations, and that data is valuable. Companies can use it to target us with ads, governments can use it for surveillance, and hackers can use it to steal our identities or worse.
So Tor and the dark web are part of this bigger conversation about control, about who has access to our information and how it's used.
Exactly. They offer a way to take back some of that control, to protect our privacy in a world where it's constantly under threat. It's about giving people the tools and knowledge to make their own choices, to navigate the online world without feeling like they're being watched or manipulated.
Exactly.
And it also raises some big questions about security and freedom online. How much privacy are we willing to give up for security, and who gets to decide?
Those are tough questions, and there are no easy answers.
But they're questions we all need to be thinking about, especially as technology keeps advancing and the line between our online and offline lives gets blurrier.
Absolutely.
You know, it's really fascinating to think about the impact Tor and the hidden internet have had on things, like facilitating huge journalistic investigations or empowering activists in places where they don't have a lot of freedom. It just shows how technology can be a force for good, but also a source of concern. It really depends on how it's used.
Yeah, and it really highlights that duality we've been talking about, right? Like on the one hand, Tor gives individuals this tool to protect their privacy and access information freely. But on the other hand, It can be used for all sorts of illicit activities, which obviously creates challenges for security and law enforcement. So it raises this really important question. How do we navigate that? How do we harness the positive potential of something like Tor while also minimizing the risks?
It's a tough question. And it gets even harder when you consider how fast the digital world changes. Like what might be considered secure today could be totally vulnerable tomorrow. And there are always new technologies popping up, each with its own set of opportunities and challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why it's so important to be digitally literate, to know what tools are out there, to understand their limitations, and to make informed choices about how we use them. It's not just about knowing how to use Tor. It's about understanding these bigger issues, like privacy, security, and freedom in the digital age.
Right. It's about more than just the tech itself. It's about how we choose to interact with it, both as individuals and as a society.
Exactly. It's a shared responsibility. Developers need to build tools with privacy and security in mind. Policymakers need to create laws that balance freedom with safety. And we all need to educate ourselves and advocate for a digital world that reflects our values.
This whole conversation has been really eye-opening for me. It's made me think about the internet in a totally different way. I definitely have a better understanding now, not just of how Tor and the hidden internet work, but also of the bigger picture, like the impact they have on our lives in the future. What's the biggest takeaway for you?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is this.
Hmm.
Technology itself isn't good or bad. It's just a tool. What matters is how we choose to use it. And as technology keeps developing, it's up to us to make sure it's used for good, to make sure it benefits humanity.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on. So to all of you listening, think about what we've discussed today and ask yourself, how do you feel about the balance between privacy and security online? Can we have both, or do we have to choose one over the other? It's a complicated question, but it's one we all need to consider. And if you want to learn more about Tor and the hidden internet, be sure to check out the official Tor project website. It's a great resource. That's all for this deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring. This is The Deep Dive, signing off.